Good morning. I'm Christa Case Bryant, the editor of the Christian Science Monitor. Thank you so much for joining us for this live chat with Scott Peterson, our senior Middle East correspondent. This weekend, U.S. President Donald Trump announced major combat operations against Iran, and the U.S. and Israel launched a barrage of missile strikes on the country. Iran retaliated over the weekend, striking U.S. troops as well as civilian areas in Arab countries who are allied with the U.S. The strikes killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has been a central figure since the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. I'm here with Scott to delve into these developments. Scott has made 45 trips into Iran as a journalist. He's also the author of Let the Swords Encircle Me, Iran, A Journey Behind the Headlines. Scott, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
And just to frame the conversation this morning, we'll be focusing on questions about the implications for Iran and the Middle East, and we won't be getting into U.S. politics. We'll maybe save that for another live chat. Okay, so let's start with a question many people want to know, Scott. How significant are these developments? Is this similar to the lightning round of strikes that we saw last June when the U.S. took out several key nuclear installations in Iran, or is this something much broader?
Yeah, I think the only kind of basis of comparison that we have at the moment is with those strikes that took place in June. And you remember then we had those were started by a surprise Israeli air campaign against Iran. They started in the course of U.S. and Iranian nuclear negotiations, which were underway at that time. And then President Trump engaged the United States kind of toward the end of that campaign with three particular strike locations, Iran's kind of crown jewel nuclear sites that required bunker busters to go deep down, and basically, as he said later, obliterated Iran's nuclear program, wiped out its chains of centrifuges enriching uranium, and more importantly, also kind of, as far as we know, buried deeply the highly enriched uranium that Iran had at that time. Now, how is that different? That was a very specific strike. The aircraft flew from the U.S., and on a 37-hour mission to do that, flew back to the U.S., never touched down anywhere else. And in this case, we've had a completely different set of parameters. The United States military has been building up, and the Israeli military has been building up too, but the U.S. has been deploying 2 aircraft carriers, hundreds of jet fighters, refueling aircraft, all kinds of air defenses and systems all around Iran in the buildup to this strike. And now it started on Saturday and on the 28th of February. In the first wave, we had Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader of 37 years, taken out, as well as upwards of 40 senior commanders and other leaders, and past leaders, in fact. So, and then the statements that we've had since then, both from President Trump and from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was that this was, really making it sound like regime change is what is on the cards and what they're expecting. And we've had literally President Trump saying, this is an opportunity of a lifetime for you Iranians. I am now the president who's going to deliver this to you. You need to seize this opportunity.
Right. And we had Netanyahu in Israel talking about removing the yoke of tyranny from your necks. So I think it would be really helpful for our listeners to understand to what extent was there support for Khamenei and for the regime more broadly. There was a joke that you included in your wonderful piece on Sunday about Khamenei's death that had been making the rounds in recent years. Missiles we have, diapers we don't.
Right. Yes, exactly. Iranians tell this joke all the time, Mushak hast, Pishak nist. And Pushak Nist, and that joke actually goes back several years at a time when there just happened to be a diaper shortage in Iran. And I remember going there at that time, visiting Iran during that time and going into a supermarket and finding that sure enough, you just could not find any diapers. And so, who knows how Iranian children and babies got through all that, and families and mothers and parents and fathers. But anyway, they did get through it. But the point was that so much money of the state and of the Islamic Republic had been invested in supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon, in kind of building up this axis of resistance, the militia allies that Iran had been supporting for years, obviously decades in the case of Hezbollah, but also a number of other key players around the region, so that they could kind of combat U.S. and Israeli influence. And then on top of that, of course, you had the billions of dollars that were also sunk into Iran's nuclear program, which had, yet to yield very much actual, nuclear energy, which is what its primary purpose was, and also a vast missile arsenal. Remember that those were the choices that the Islamic Republic has had to make since 1979, because always its arch foes, both the United States and Israel, very superior militaries in both of those cases. And so for Iran, they always had to opt for asymmetric means. And in that sense, the missile capabilities, what now are very, very capable drone capacities, those are the things that they've had to deploy, and all kinds of tactics too, swarming tactics and that sort of thing against against U.S. ships and things. So unconventional means in many respects that Iran has deployed. But the point is that over the years, as we've had episodes of kind of public protests on the streets, protests that might have started initially with something like an economic grievance, as took place in January, or we had Masa Amini protests beginning in 2022, when some kind of enforcers or morality police, basically took in a young lady and she died in custody for not wearing her hair, appropriately covered. That sparked a huge amount of nationwide protests. And in every instance, these protests turn into anti-regime protests. And in the course of those, you have people complaining. They say, why is it we don't care about Gaza? We don't care about Lebanon. Why are we throwing all our money away at this when what we really need is support here at home? They've been hit by sanctions. The economy has been struggling for many, many years. And the Islamic Republic, due to corruption, due to sanctions, and due to mismanagement, has not been able to get a hold of those grievances at all.
Well, and I'm curious your thoughts, going back a number of years now, late 1980s, right, that the Iran-Iraq war wrapped up, and that was just an incredibly difficult war for the Iranian people, just so many people sacrificed. How have the attitudes toward the regime changed since then? Like, is there appetite in Iran for fighting this kind of conflict in the Middle East, or do the protests that we saw in January indicate such a weakening of the regime's status or influence or moral authority that there just really isn't popular support for a kind of campaign like we've seen this weekend to continue much longer?
So there are a multitude of questions there, which I will try to unpack in one after another. But in the initial instance, I mean, the perception in Washington is that the Islamic Republic right now is in a very, very weak state. So not only did we have that 12-day air campaign by the Israelis and by the United States in last June, we've also obviously seen, now 3 days of very heavy strikes. I mean, more than 1,000 airstrikes took place in the first 12 hours. We just heard from the Pentagon, taking out all kinds of targets, leadership targets, and certainly they are going after ballistic missiles. They're going after, security bases, that sort of thing. But if you pull back a little bit, the last 2.5 years really has seen the kind of unraveling, shall we say, of that axis of resistance, that Iran had so carefully cultivated for so many years. I mean, in the first instance we had on the 7th of October, 2023, we had Hamas, an Iran-backed, Palestinian group that attacked from Gaza into Israel, killing over 1,000 Israelis. And this triggered a very ferocious response by the Israelis against every single element of that axis, really in turn. So they went after Hamas, of course, in Gaza, and we saw more than 70,000 people killed in the space of that conflict over the course of 2 years. But then also turning toward Hezbollah in Lebanon. And, basically there was an incremental war. Hezbollah, of course, started with this concept of unity of arenas. In other words, all right, if Gaza's attacked, then we need to, kind of fight on behalf of our fellow brothers. So they started firing rockets and things into Israel incrementally, Israel responding incrementally, build up. And after almost more than a year, then Israel absolutely took the gloves off, had the opportunity to do it. struck. I'm sure you'll remember that extraordinary attack of thousands of exploding pagers. Israel had a 10-year long clandestine effort to kind of infiltrate the supply line of Hezbollah's pagers that were used by Hezbollah operatives. And sure enough, on the day they pressed the explode button, off they went. And so all kinds of Hezbollah operatives running around now with missing hands, damaged and basically out of action in terms of the fight. That caught them off guard. Then Israel managed to kill their leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Again, had been on the run, for 25 more years, since he'd been the leader of Hezbollah, and just one blow after another entire air campaign. So Hezbollah these days is a shadow of its former self. And Israel has just taken on and dismantled part after part after part. Then we saw Israel, and then backed by the United States, specifically going after Iran. So from their perspective, they have very much weakened Iran's capabilities, and their perspective, their declared effort now, both the United States and Israel, is to basically deprive Iran of its strategic capabilities. So make sure that its nuclear program can never, be resurrected at all, much less created a bomb. Can no longer have missiles, so they're going after missile strikes and your missile launch pads and Iran's very large missile inventory. And they're going after, President Trump said they were going to sink the entire Navy. Already, 9 ships went down on the first day. So we'll see how Iran responds. But that also now is turning into, kind of a regional war where, Iran, again, as it aims towards survival, is also trying to, convince some of the U.S. allies in the Gulf, specifically GCC countries and others that have been under fire, to convince Israel and the United States to pull in the reins.
So up until, for the past year, a lot of the focus has been specifically on trying to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That was the justification for attacking those 3 key sites over the summer. In those attacks that you talked about at the beginning, where the U.S. sent fighter jets from, I think it was Missouri that they took off from. And we had been watching the progress of indirect talks mediated by Oman in recent weeks that seemed to be making some progress between the U.S. and Iran. Why do you think the calculation was made? To your point, Israel in particular, but also with help from the U.S., had removed so many key assets and capabilities from Iran over the past year in the wake of that Iran-backed Hamas attack on Israel. Why do you think they felt that the moment was right now to go in? And is it about the nuclear capabilities? Was there evidence that Iran had been continuing to work on that since the summer, or is it something broader here now?
Well, I think it's definitely something that is broader. Both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are portraying this as some kind of imminent threat, and therefore they needed to act. It seems instead, and in fact, we even know from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, which is basically the UN's nuclear watchdog, that almost nothing had changed at all since June, when this nuclear program had been really subjected to some serious blast by the United States. So obliterated, well, maybe or maybe not, but it wasn't being reconstituted in any way that was threatening. And even then, Iran had only achieved a certain level. Of course, it was only it was a short technical step to getting to a bomb grade nuclear material, and had enough to maybe make a dozen bombs. That's the state that Iran was in last June when the program was attacked. But this is very far still from kind of weaponizing something and then weaponizing it to a size that it could actually be delivered by a ballistic missile. These are things that normally would take years, to occur. So no new imminent threat that anyone can tell. Even the IAEA has said that nothing new was on the table, but it appears that there was an opportunity, and like I said, the perception of weakness in Washington, the perception that Iran is weak, that it's at a weak moment. And then that was only exacerbated by these incredible nationwide protests that kicked off in early January, and we all witnessed this. They started with the Bazari, traders in the bazaar in Tehran, and elsewhere saying, there was a precipitous drop in the value of the currency, and they decided they could no longer, make their imports or do business in any profitable way, and so they closed up their shops. And that economic trigger, within days, turned into much, much larger nationwide protests, and they got bigger and bigger. People shouting "Margbar America," "Margbar Khamenei," "Margbar dictator," "Death to the dictator," "Death to Khamenei." And we've seen this again and again, but in this case, there were huge numbers of people that came out. And of course, the regime, the Islamic Republic and its leadership, were concerned about this kind of dual threat happening at the same time. Throughout the Islamic Republic's 47-year history, they never at the same time experienced the threat from the street, where people were really on the streets and really demonstrating their own happiness, as well as potentially an existential threat coming from outside, coming from the United States or coming from Israel. So one of the reasons why, when they decided to crack down, they went in the most unprecedented and brutal manner, killing, at a minimum 7,000 people, and could be upwards of 20,000 or more, actually. I mean, there's still a lot of fatalities that have yet to be resolved, but certainly confirmed more than 7,000 people. They are massacred in the space of 2 days. Now, in all the previous episodes of very large nationwide protests in Iran, we have had, no more than, say, 500, at the very most 1,500 people killed, and that would be over the space of many, many weeks. So, like, never before has there been this kind of a death toll. And also never before have we had such a degree and level of lethal brutality applied that then, at the same time, didn't yield a single defection so far from any of the people who were doing this. I mean, these are the Islamic, the Revolutionary Guard forces and their kind of Basij volunteer militia, who are on the streets. They're the ones who are pulling the triggers and doing the shooting and doing the killing. So the fact that that was happening, the fact that President Trump, on multiple occasions, and I even saw one count, 9 potential counts, where he said, if you kill protesters, you're going to get hit very, very hard. And then he kind of seemed to back away from that. It didn't happen. And then all of a sudden, 7,000 people are dead. Anyway, now maybe is the, kind of the action, that's also one of the results of that, and one of the reasons why maybe the timing is happening right now.
So do you think it'd be fair to say then that maybe there was a calculus among U.S. and Israel officials and experts that while Iran's capabilities had been definitely reduced since the summer as a result of all of the actions that we've talked about, that this was a moment where they were particularly weak, and it could be a moment to go in and sort of finish off whatever remnants there were of this threat, even if they weren't capable of making good on it right now, if they still had those intentions, this was a moment to cut it off. And I think, as you've mentioned, Iran did back a number of proxies in the region, including Hamas. I think, if I'm correct, Hamas received some training in Iran for that attack on Israel that sparked that 2-year war. And so for those who felt that the regime still had those intentions, this was a prime moment to go in and be sure that they would never be able to make good on that. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think that was definitely Israel's calculation. And remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been speaking about Iran as a threat for more than 30 years. I mean, this has been his kind of go-to line, and it's never changed. And so this is a golden moment for Israel, and he would have been in President Trump's ear. Of course, President Trump has made it very clear that he's not interested in these kind of forever wars, and has been very critical of the Iraq War, the Afghan War, where Americans were engaged with hundreds of thousands of troops over the space of decades. He didn't want to do anything like that. Past presidents have avoided this kind of action in Iran, partly because the country is 3 times bigger than Iraq, with a population much, much larger as well, and also a very sophisticated population, but also an ideological cast to this regime. This isn't like, in the aftermath, for example, of, the fall of Saddam Hussein. I mean, the Iraqi fedayeen and the, kind of the military were never going to stand up. They were in it for the paychecks. There was no ideological love for Saddam Hussein. Here, there is very deep ideological love by probably, 15% or so of the population for the supreme leader, Khamenei, who is seen as God's representative on earth, as an infallible, actually a marja, who's a, kind of a Shiite theologian of great standing. And people who followed, who really do follow him would follow him to the grave. And that is something that neither Iraq or Afghanistan was able to bring to the table in terms of, kind of the quality of the insurgency. And yet still there were insurgents that, that really caused Americans to feel the pain. And I think that, here we would, if there were actual, kind of, if the regime fell, the concern is, certainly analysts have told me that, and this is evident, that, unless the monopoly of power on the streets changes, unless those, volunteer militiamen and the Basij and the Revolutionary Guard are no longer able to exert force, and how that can be removed, who knows, then you're going to have, an incredible insurgency, and it could be also very, very, challenging for, for Iranians themselves as they try to, kind of take control of the institutions, as Mr. Trump has suggested.
Right. Well, we've got a number of questions from our readers that touch on some of those points. So before we dive into those in just a minute, as a reminder, I just wanted to let our listeners remember that they can download the new Monitor app in the Apple Store. It's called the Christian Science Monitor app, and it's also available on Google Play. And the app is available for a limited time without a subscription. So anybody can access it and enjoy that content to see what it offers and to provide feedback. So let's dive into some of these questions. And also for anyone tuning in live on YouTube and Facebook, feel free to put those in the chat. We're monitoring those so that we can be as responsive as possible. So we got one in earlier saying, Scott, that your reporting has shown the deep involvement of the Shiite clergy with every aspect of Iran's government, both local and national. So to what extent do you think it might be possible for any new regime to take control without the support of that clergy?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, considering that we have the Islamic Republic established by an Islamic revolution in 1979, led by a, grand Ayatollah, Ruhollah Khomeini. And, and in those days, people were not so very afraid of religion. I mean, the surprising fact that Iranians and Iran analysts will tell you is that, the pro-West regime of the Shah of Iran managed to turn, even though it was completely secular, managed to turn people toward religion, whereas this Islamic Republic has been so fierce, especially increasingly fierce in its level of repression and requirement of support and certain aspects of, getting into everybody's personal lives and things, that they've actually turned people off religion. So, in ways that, like, you couldn't have imagined. I mean, the Shah would have been very happy to have seen such a degree of secularism. So you really do have that now going in Iran. And, this has been an issue. The grip of the clergy, the amount of respect that people have for the clergy is something that has been on the decline for many, many years. This isn't just something that, like, now, something has been broken in some kind of social contract, in January that now changes everything. I mean, this clergy, because of the actions they've taken, because of the levels of corruption that have gone into, all of these, the way that this system works, has been clear to everybody, and it has not turned them toward religion in, by any respect. So, I mean, I remember a great movie called Marmulak, which means lizard, from several years ago. I mean, probably 15 or 20 years ago. And it basically is about a prisoner who escapes from Evin prison. And the way he does it is he dresses up as a cleric and pretends that he's the cleric who's supposed to be ministering to the prisoners. And he gets out on the street. He tries to hail a cab. He nearly gets run over because nobody wants to pick up a cleric, on the street. Because he's wearing his clerical robes. And that is kind of, one of the scenes that goes through the entire film, that he's running into all sorts of trouble because he's actually looks like a cleric. And that was 20 years ago. Well, that situation has just grown, worse and worse. And, the sense that for many, many Iranians, and I think, for those, there was a kind of a surge of popular support for the Islamic Republic back in June after the Israeli and U.S. strikes. There was kind of a rally around the flag, even a rally around the regime, which was quite distinctive. And Iran's leaders actually thanked people for that happening. But after what's happened in January, the spectrum has completely changed. I mean, that level of bloodshed, that level of violence has just made people think, gone completely the opposite way and just say there's nothing, there's nothing there's no redeeming factor, redeeming value anymore in this Islamic Republic. We need to get rid of it, to the point where literally people we're speaking to in Iran, now have been cheering the death of the supreme leader. And, I just literally received an interview from a student that we spoke to a few days ago who'd been protesting. And, and he just said, we have no idea what's coming, but we absolutely welcome the fact that change is happening one way or another. And the critical thing, as he says, is that it needs to be complete, this change, because otherwise there could be much, much worse ahead for Iranians.
Right. Super interesting. So that touches on another question we got from a reader about, as you noted, both Trump and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu have essentially said, this is your opportunity, Iranians, take possession of your country. Who stands in the wings to take over? The Revolutionary Guard or the Shah's son living in exile? Is there a realistic scenario under which some new power could gain control of the country? Or is that security apparatus that Khamenei has increasingly relied on, that has become increasingly repressive, as you wrote in your piece yesterday about Khamenei and his influence on the country, are those just too strong for anyone else to come in, even if the top leadership has been eliminated?
Well, I'm pleased that you used the word realistic, because I think there's a lot of daydreaming going on. I mean, it's one thing to be in Washington or, Mar-a-Lago or wherever and say, oh, just grab take hold of your institutions, but if anyone who's been in Iran knows the size of the place, knows how integrated into people's daily lives every aspect of this Islamic Republic is. It isn't just a question of your Revolutionary Guard, post down at the end of the street, or your local Basiji, unit that's, in your local mosque. It's a question of a complete control, complete integration into everyone's aspect of their lives. I mean, in Iran, at least, for all these decades, people have been able to live their lives, behind, kind of behind closed doors. So in other words, those had usually been kind of safety valve sanctuaries for people, and they could party, they could do, whatever else they wanted to do, and kind of live a non-hijab, headscarf lives, and, and do what they wanted. But, so many other aspects, every single thing that's done in public is so carefully watched and has been so, so carefully enforced. And people have just, people have just, grown so weary and so tired of that, to the point where they are looking for alternatives. Now, in theory, the structure that controls the most, and in the aftermath of regime change, would actually be the Revolutionary Guard. They are the ones who, in some measure, thanks to sanctions, but also because of the way the system has been structured, they control so many elements of the economy. They control so many aspects of of the enforcement, people's lives, but also the security for the whole country. They're in charge of the missile force. They're in charge of, of course, all of the different, militias abroad from Hezbollah and elsewhere. They're the ones channeling all the, state funds into those places. They're the ones who fought in Syria to save, Bashar al-Assad, and those. So those are the decisions that they've been making. They are the most efficient structure, I would say, that's in the country. There isn't some kind of clerical master diagram that kind of runs the whole thing. But on the day-to-day basis, it's the Revolutionary Guard. However, completely ideological, and have only become more ideological as the years have gone by, and as you also have a new, younger generation of ideologues who are stronger and more hardline than many of their predecessors. So can they run the show? I mean, in the way that, for example, in Venezuela, where you take out Maduro, but then there's some kind of the structure has stayed in place. This is the model And I know that President Trump has discussed that in interviews yesterday, and today, that maybe that would be the best example for Iran. But the Revolutionary Guard, as capable as they are probably incapable of playing the role of like, oh yes, well let's just play along with the United States after half a century of them being our arch foes. And I don't think we can underestimate the significance of half a century of real, flag burning and blood spilt and mutual conflict between the United States and Iran. But on the other hand, who is left? I mean, you mentioned the son of the Shah. There have been, of course, there has been a push toward supporting him in Iran in ways that I never would have imagined possible even 5 years ago, even 2 years ago. So he has some kind of obviously the only one really who has a lot of name recognition. But he's coming from outside, hasn't set foot in the country for 47 years either, and has, no kind of ground game inside Iran that would be credible. So at best, he could be an interim player. But honestly, when President Trump says, I have 3 people on my short list who would be great, great follow-on leaders, he hasn't mentioned who those are. But, this is a very, very complex game for Iran and in Iran.
Now, in addition to being our Middle East correspondent, you're also our veteran war correspondent, and you've been to Ukraine many times. So a reader has a question here. They note that Iran has been supplying Russia with drones and is wondering if this conflict in the Middle East with Iran will have an effect on the war in Ukraine. What's your take on that?
Well, I think, thanks. That's a great question. And you're right. I've been to Ukraine a dozen times during this current conflict. And one of the things that Russia has really extracted from Iran has been the design of the Shahed drone. The Iranians made a version of it. The Russians basically, they shared it with the Russians, and now the Russians are mass producing a very, very good version of it, multiple versions of it, different variations. They've set up entire warehouses and factories just to build this drone. The reason they do that is because they have learned that this drone can fly. They can saturate a city with 500, 600, 700 of these drones in a single night. And basically overwhelm Ukraine's air defense systems, and then drop in ballistic missiles when there's nothing left to kind of shoot those down. So it's been incredibly effective for the Russians, and that alliance between Russia and Iran has been one of the really critical ingredients to Russia's ability to cause the Iranians, certainly, or the Ukrainians, especially over the winter, this last winter, which was the coldest that anyone can remember, right? And the Russians were knocking out electrical systems, right, left, and center, and really it was just completely frigid. So, but the thing is that I don't know that the Iranians have a lot more left to offer Russia. That Shahed was critical. The Russians have it now, and the Russians obviously know exactly what they're doing with missiles, ballistic missiles, ICBMs. They've got all sorts of tools up their sleeve, but the Shahed really filled a gap. So, although we've obviously had President Vladimir Putin say, wow, we shouldn't be attacking Iran, et cetera, because it's, his very, very close ally, Russia is not doing very much. I do understand that they brought in some Starlink jamming equipment right during the protests in January. And you'll remember that in January, at the height of the killing of the crackdown, they basically, the whole country went black. And Starlinks, there were tens of thousands of Starlinks that had been smuggled into the country, and those also were jammed just for at least 24 hours, if not more. So, and that apparently was Russian work, Russian support.
Interesting. So you also spent some time in Moscow as our bureau chief there. Do you think that this conflict and the aggressiveness and intensity with which the U.S. and Israel have prosecuted it will give Putin pause at all as he continues the war in Iran? And also, many people have observed that China is looking on to see how the course of the Russia-Ukraine war unfolds, to what extent the U.S. and Europe present a united front in defending Ukraine because China has designs on Taiwan. So to what extent do you think this conflict in the Middle East could have implications for either Russia or China and how they're thinking about their own broader ambitions?
Well, I think in China's case, I don't think President Putin has been lacking in reasons for doing what he wants to be doing. I mean, he'll lay down, whatever excuse to continue prosecuting this war until he gets what he wants. It obviously makes it easier for him if a country like the United States, as well as Israel, attack Iran in an unprovoked way. I mean, this is a war of choice, no question. I'm not sure how many people believe, that there was some kind of imminent threat. I mean, analysts up and down say that there wasn't anyone, and for those of us who watch very, very closely, there wasn't an imminent threat. And yet the United States is conducting the kind of attack that is aiming at regime change and removing all strategic capacities of Iran, in the same way that when Russia invaded in February 2022, of course, their purpose was to actually absorb Ukraine completely, remove the Ukraineness of it, and basically take it over. Now, that's not what the United States is intending to do, and in terms of Iran, it's about regime change, and in theory, paving the way for Iranians to come up with their own solution in the aftermath of that, but at least to remove the regime. But there's no talk of like kind of occupying Iran or anything like that, which is definitely what President Putin wants to do. But in terms of the kind of breakdown of like international law, and in the old days, one had to make a big case. Like remember before the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, based on faulty intelligence, layers of it, but at least a case was being made for many, many months. There was a lot of debate about, is it real, is it not? But, there was an effort made to also in the UN Security Council to try and, make sure that whatever happened was deemed to be legal at least. And, here, there seems to be no game plan. There seems to be no, casus belli. There seems to be no, I mean, it does seem to have, been a calculation of opportunity, but we're just at the very beginning of an incredibly long throw with this conflict. I think this is not going to end tomorrow.
I'm glad you raised that comparison with the U.S. Involvement in Iraq, because a number of people have been mentioning that. This is the largest the U.S. military buildup in the region since the Iraq War started in 2003. So that's 23 years ago now. And at that point, it became clear that we did not have solid intelligence on the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which was the justification, the primary justification used at the time in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. In this case, Iran's track record in the region is pretty well established as supporting proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas that you mentioned. And the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, has also been active abroad. So to what extent has Iran sort of meddled in regional or even global affairs in a way that also contravenes the international order and is, I guess just laying that out, I think would be helpful for readers.
So Iran's perspective has been with these proxy forces that those were its first lines of defense. Remember, it's never going to beat the United States or Israel in a conventional face-to-face conflict, which is what we're in right now, right? I mean, Iran is not going to win this. I mean, the best they're going to be able to do is survive and get through. And I think that that's the regime strategy at the moment, is to try and do that and find the best way to do that and come out the other end and basically see what's left. But the strategy of supporting Hezbollah, the strategy of supporting the Iraqi, the Shia, kind of pro-Iran groups in Iraq, supporting, and all of these different Hamas and others, is basically to tie up your archfoe who's closest, which is Israel, with these forces that were, always meant to be deterrent. I mean, I think there's an interesting dynamic. I mean, the very fact that Hamas initiated this attack in October 2003, which has now changed everything.
2023. I mean,
yeah. Sorry, 2023. Yeah, which has now changed everything. That was not part of the actual overall game plan. Hamas fully expected Hezbollah the next day to weigh in and just start launching missiles at Israel. It expected Iran to do the exact same thing. And Iran and Hezbollah instead said, we wish you guys the best of luck, but, now isn't the time for war and I mean, they really were not interested. And they actually, the very fact that they were kind of so reluctant throughout and messaged that repeatedly, we don't want to get in a full-on war with Israel, we don't want to get in a full-on war with the United States, that actually like I think helped encourage Israel over time to think, wow, okay, now is the time to actually take these implacable enemies of ours and start striking them. Because, and we've watched Israel take multiple steps, killing a Hamas leader, through incredible intelligence in Tehran, no less, but hardly a response, coming from the Iranians, or at least a delayed one. Hezbollah taking hit after hit with multiple assassinations and things, and not responding in a way that they always said they would, which is like a full-on strike, missiles all over Tel Aviv. So that reluctance on the part of the axis of resistance, everyone except Hamas. And meanwhile, Hamas was getting hit, repeatedly in Gaza, along with so many Palestinians. All of that has helped get us to this point where the United States and Israel might feel, right, the last thing to do is to take care of this Islamic regime itself. And now we've removed the potency of those other, deterrent factors. But that's what it was apart. Sure, of course, was that, was it legal? Was it not legal? I mean, how does that fit into the broader picture? I don't know. But when you are a country that has to come up with asymmetric, means of defending yourself, it made a lot of sense, of course, for the Revolutionary Guard to do that.
So I believe the U.S. has designated Iran as a state sponsor of terror. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. This is for State Department reports going back decades refer to this as the world's lead sponsor of state terror.
So is that a legitimate tag? And what led to that designation?
Well, all kinds of things. I mean, and some of which actually, when Trump was making his first speech after Saturday, when things really, when this air campaign got underway, he threw way back to 1979, the holding of, revolutionary radical students took over the U.S. embassy in Tehran, holding 52 diplomats for 444 days. This was for the Americans. This is the day that time starts in terms of just being against this regime. For the Iranians, they will tell you that their anti-American animus stretches back to 1953, when the CIA mounted its first ever coup d'etat, getting rid of the popular elected Prime Minister Mossadegh at that time, and mounting that coup. So that's when the Iranians start their grievance list, right? And so each one goes back and forth and back and forth. President Trump mentioned the blowing up of the Marine barracks in Beirut, in the early 1980s, as something that Iran was deeply engaged in, with Hezbollah, of course. And anyway, just one thing after another, and those so. Of course, this was easy. Also, who are the state sponsors of terror? I mean, what other states are kind of ideologically, Islamic, of course, driven, that would fit a pattern that, that are your enemies, and also, using unconventional means. And in Iran has absolutely fit that bill. I mean, certainly in the 1980s, the Islamic Republic went after Shah era officials and others in some of the most brutal killings going on in Europe and elsewhere. In fact, for years, there was an assassin who Dawood Salahuddin, who also he was an American dressed up as a postman and killed a former Shah official in Maryland, and then fled to Iran, and he's been living a kind of pretty unhappy life there for quite some time, in fact. But the point is that the number of grievances on both sides is really very serious, and of course that just meant that there was a tag. I mean, Hezbollah can't be a state sponsor of terror because it's not a state. You know what I mean? There are not many. North Korea, on that list. Sudan for a while. So anyway, That's how it snagged that tag.
Well, and so that coup that you mentioned in 1953, the U.S. installed the Shah then, right? And then it was the Islamic Revolution that kicked the Shah out in 1979. Now we have another reader question about the Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi. And they're asking, they're saying he's been talked about by some Iranians as someone who might return, as we mentioned earlier. Can he prevent the country from falling apart?
That's a great question, and I expect he probably can't. Right now, more and more people are, kind of rallying around him as as pretty much the only person that can be rallied around. He obviously speaks a relatively good game. He has name recognition. I don't think, Iranians don't want the monarchy back, and he would represent that. But here is someone who at least, people have begun to coalesce around. But to give you an idea about how little support he actually has in the country, so I've made 45 visits to Iran. I've interviewed people all over the place, wrote a book about it. Only one time in every single one of those visits, which admittedly I haven't been able to get back for the last 5 years or so, in every single one of those visits, either people were dismissive if his name ever came up, or they just because dismissive, or it just didn't come up. He didn't factor in anybody's hopes, aspirations, or inspirations. One time when I was out on the streets, interviewing someone, like literally a lady takes off her shoe and holds it up, and inside the heel is a picture of Reza Pahlavi, right? Like right there inside the heel of her shoe. And that was like, she was like, haha. And like, okay, so you're a supporter. Great. You're a monarchist. I mean, that was the one time in all those visits. So, he doesn't have a huge amount of grassroots support or anything else. As a, interim or a buffer, person, he can probably make a somewhat good case. And like I say, more and more people inside Iran are clearly, going that way. And he himself helped trigger the largest turnout that night on the January 8th. He said, everybody come out onto the streets, and people did come out on the streets that night. And that was the first night of the real extensive killing. So it remains to be seen, but he's got a really uphill battle to gain credibility inside.
Okay, thanks so much. These are great answers. I'm sure our listeners are enjoying it. And just a reminder for anyone who's tuning in more recently, you can add your question to the chat in YouTube or Facebook, and we're monitoring those and feeding them into the conversation. So, Scott, you mentioned your book, Let the Swords Encircle Me, is the tagline of it. And that comes, as I understand, from an idea in Shiite martyrdom. Could you talk a little bit about that and how much that may be affecting the way at least the clerical elite may be interpreting these current events?
So I think, when we look, for example, at the assassination of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, we should remember that his whole kind of worldview about facing off with a bigger enemy, but standing firm, in the name of justice and, as he sees it and everything else, this is directly coming from kind of the most important story in Shia theology, right? So all the iconography for Shia, and of course the majority of Iranians are.
And maybe could you just remind people the difference between Sunni and Shiite Muslims?
Well, so I mean, better to do it geographically than theologically right at the moment, because the important thing is that Iranians are largely Shia, and certainly the regime is. I mean, there's also a majority of Shia in Iraq as well, which is where there are actually more Shiite shrines of Shiite imams. Iran only has, even though it's a huge country, only has one Shiite shrine. That's Imam Reza, which is in Mashhad. He's the 8th imam, and that is, because they only have one, it is the most, it's got, glass, gilt, everything. It's truly extraordinary. But the story that really matters for the, and by the way, so to answer your question better, Krista, so many of the other countries in the region, most Arab countries and also Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and others are Sunni Muslim, and they are, and that's it's a split, within the ranks of religion, and not one that that goes back 14 centuries, but it's not one that also is it's relevant today because there are a lot of political connotations that that come from that. But the defining characteristic for Iranian true believers and for Shiite true believers and followers of Ayatollah Khamenei is and of before him Ayatollah Khomeini is this idea of the third of the third Shiite Imam Hussein, and there is the story where he's basically surrounded. He's a true believer, of course. He has 72 followers. He's surrounded by the armies of Yazid, and this, of course, all took place in Karbala. And there is tens of thousands of the enemy army. He's clearly going to lose. And he instead decides that he is going to stand firm and literally says, as he's surrounded and, death is certain. And he literally, says, oh, if the religion of Muhammad will only endure with my death, then, opens his tunic, let the swords encircle me. And this moment is the moment that he becomes the Lord of the martyrs for Shiites. And the whole point of this, as it's like received down, and of course, as it's received down by this revolution and by this Islamic Republic, that, the Iran-Iraq War was a perfect example of this, right? They call it the sacred defense, right? Because Saddam invaded and everything else, so they're defending. They are the ones who are following in the footsteps of Imam Hussein after 14 centuries. They're the ones who are looking to that example that took place in 680 AD. And there's a great, statement, that Shia, that Shia believe, and that is that, that every day is Ashura, which is the day that they mark, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, and every place is Karbala. And that is, and that's the place where it all happens. So Shiites, you will go, and Karbala today is, of course, in Iraq. So people go, and you go to feel the sand where the, martyrs, where the imam's, blood was spilt and all these things. And it's, but the iconography about it is very powerful. And it has been used also across the region. So Hezbollah is, fully engaged with almost the same kind of iconography. You see it among the, the pro-Iranian Shiite militias in Iraq. It's used not by the Houthis, but you see it, and also not by Hamas and Gaza, right, which are actually Sunnis. But anyway, but the point is that this has been an absolute. This is the received concept. So when Ayatollah Khamenei just a couple of weeks ago said to President Trump, he said, "Oh yes, the American president, he's always talking about his aircraft carriers and stuff. What's more important than that is the weapon that will bring that warship to the bottom of the sea." Now, he didn't specify what weapon that was, but certainly in his mind, part of that would have been, our ideological strength, our willingness not to be fearful in the face of overwhelming odds. And in any event, that kind of martyrdom is, the kind of thing we'd aim for. So, his loyalists would have been appreciative of the fact that he was a martyr for the cause on Saturday morning.
And in some ways, that makes it very difficult to conduct modern warfare against a country where martyrdom is such a key sort of raison d'etre and how they think about things. And it's a different calculus than a Western power might have.
Well, it is. Yeah, that is right. And just one sentence on that. It's not that there's a one misconception is that like Shiites are aiming for martyrdom. Like that is the most important thing. Like they have a death wish and therefore, but you will find very, very few actual like suicide bombers, which is a very Sunni thing. I mean, radical Sunni thing that you find with Al-Qaeda and you find with Islamic State, right? Like with Shia, that just hardly any of those. It's not the same. So it's an ideological construct, but that doesn't mean that that's, the way of life that one is racing toward and everything else. But it is the kind of thing that would kick up an incredible insurgency should Americans stay or pro-American forces stay in Iran, for any period of time.
Yeah, and I think Israeli soldiers got a taste of that going into Lebanon fighting against Hezbollah fighters. So we have another reader question here. They mentioned that the late Supreme Leader apparently named several successors. Is that true? And what do we know about them?
Yes, that's right. He has named several successors. And of course, he actually also instructed that all the key leaders and all of the key commanders name successors 3 or 4 layers deep, assuming that like kind of regime decapitation was what the United States and Israel had planned to do. And of course, there were very many top people who were taken out, Revolutionary Guard commanders, key people who were taken out also last June. by the Israelis. And the Israelis have definitely had extraordinary intelligence, and the Americans too, who pinpointed the supreme leader. But the Israelis have had and been gathering intelligence on the nuclear scientists and other things for many years. So there was always the anticipation of that kind of decapitation. So he's named a few, but basically, there's one in particular, Arafi, who's really not a particularly well-known Ayatollah outside Iran, but this is a guy who's been in charge of like all the religious institutions for many years. And from a young age, he was only like 21, I think, when the revolution happened. So he was younger, kind of a younger cadre. But as soon as the Ayatollah Khamenei became the supreme leader, he began to elevate this person to quite responsible posts, wider, bigger, broader. He clearly was like one of the chosen ones. So he is actually part of this he's been named to be part of the 3-person kind of committee troika, who is meant to be, along with the president and along with the president Pezeshkian, and then also the judiciary chief, who's a very serious hardliner, Ejaei. These guys are, meant to be the ones who kind of are the interim, running of things until the Assembly of Experts, is actually able to make their choice and elect, the next supreme leader, which is meant to be happening. So, but how that plays in is Arafi strong enough, good enough, have enough constituency. And as we spoke about earlier, the clergy in general, putting their stamp on things doesn't mean what it once did. Maybe we will not have another supreme leader ever in this Islamic Republic. We don't know.
Okay, we have time for one more question, so let's end with a simple but profound and important one. Will Iran's people be better off as a result of this conflict?
That is such an excellent question, and one that really does not have an answer, because we don't know how this is going to play out. I mean, if the Iranian people take their institutions in their hands and somehow, the Islamic Republic and its security forces and loyalists somehow just kind of melt away, or decide that they're going to kind of have a completely change of lifestyle and will accept that. Well, I mean, that has potential maybe to not be so grim. But on the other hand, there's so many other alternatives that could lead to more violence, that could lead, for lots and lots of people, right? I mean, what happens if so all the leadership's gone and everything else, thousands and thousands of targets have been hit, there are no more missiles, the nuclear, project is dust, the proxies are dismantled. So, all right, and now you still have all the structures that have been built up for nearly half a century kind of still in place in Iran, and they're still ideological. And now they want revenge against those people who have been shouting on the streets and, and cheered the killing of Ayatollah Khamenei. I mean, how is that going to fit? We don't know, because, breaking new ground, aside from the U.S. and Israeli strikes, has also been what the regime enforcers were willing to do, that we saw in January. And I think that that's why there are just so many variables. There's so many questions. And, and again, we do know, history tells us that no regime change has yielded a friendlier government if it only was, exacted at the end of air power, right? It's always taken boots on the ground to make those kind of changes. So I think that's why we're just in really uncharted territory.
Well, thank you so much for helping us understand that uncharted territory. We've been with Scott Peterson, the Christian Science Monitor's senior Middle East correspondent, for the last hour. If you missed some of the conversation or want to review it or share it with friends, a replay will be available on YouTube and on Facebook shortly after this event. So we'd like to thank the people behind the scenes for the event. Our events team is led by Promotions and Events Manager Lauren Crandall. Mandy K. Pechek produced our event with support from Greg Fitzgerald. And our studio crew included Ian Blackier, Vincent Lomascalo, Ian Case, Morgan Anderson, and Noel Flatt. I'm Christa Case Bryant, editor of the Christian Science Monitor. I'd encourage you to check out our coverage, including Scott's great piece yesterday on Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and his 37 years as a supreme leader in Iran and what his death means for the country, on our website or on our new app, the Christian Science Monitor app, which is available on the Apple Store and on Google Play. Thanks so much for joining us.